All right, good morning. Today we're going to be talking about critical thinking. Once more, I'd like to apologize for my absence today. However, I've been ill for a few days and getting there, getting better. Um, as a quick reminder, we are going to be meeting on Wednesday, so please make sure that you're not absent. I'll remind you, you have your first prep day for your collaborative learning assignment on Wednesday, so it is really, really, really important that you show up on time and that if you are going to be absent, you let me know, you let your group know as well. Remember that if you are absent during Wednesday's class, you need to come prepared for the 16th. If you are not prepared on the 16th and you were absent this Wednesday, you will have to complete the project by yourself. So that's really important that you are present or that you are prepared, especially because I don't think it is fair for your classmates to obviously spend time completing the assignment and then you get a grade for work that you didn't do. So, les recuerdo, por si acaso en español, aunque lamentablemente me tuve que ausentar, el miércoles hay clase en el salón. Es muy importante que lleguen a tiempo, no lleguen tarde, o por lo menos si van a llegar tarde, que no sea algo absurdamente tarde. Y si van a ausentarse, me lo tienen que notificar, se lo tienen que notificar a su grupo también. Recuerden que si se ausentan el miércoles, el 14 no hay clase, el 16 el próximo día de preparación. Si usted el 16 llega, luego de faltar el 9 y no tiene nada preparado para la sección que su grupo le asignó, usted le va a tocar hacer el trabajo completamente solo. So, muy importante que se presenten, que si no se presentan, se preparen, si no, el trabajo individualmente, tienen que llegar a los 10 minutos individualmente, hacer todas las partes usted solo. Antes de empezar con el tema de hoy, les recuerdo, aparte de lo que ya les mencioné, que el trabajo del Collaborative Learning se entrega como un video el 18 de octubre, solamente una persona entrega por grupo. También aprovecho y les recuerdo que lo más probable Canvas va a decir que el video es demasiado grande, demasiado pesado, así que lo pueden subir a Google Drive, Dropbox, iCloud, o lo pueden subir como un video privado a YouTube y en vez de pues, ponerme el video en la tarea, me ponen el enlace. Es muy importante, ¿verdad? Si lo están haciendo de esa manera, asegúrense que mi email tenga permiso para accesar el file, el archivo. Entonces, luego de eso, tienen una discusión oral el 21 de octubre. Van a tener 50 minutos para prepararse en clase, los últimos 30 van a presentar. Le voy a estar entonces asignando los grupos mediante email y Canvas el lunes que viene, que es feriado. So, estén pendientes de sus emails para que sepan en qué grupo les tocó. Entonces, tienen un debate el 30 de octubre. Esa clase del 16 voy a tomar un momentito al principio de clase, aparte de para tomar asistencia, particularmente para esos grupos que quizás solo les falte grabar. Voy a tomar el momento para entonces llevarle 3 opciones distintas para que voten por la opción que prefieren. Eso va a contar básicamente como su asistencia, marcar la opción que ustedes prefieren. Entonces, luego de eso, ¿verdad? Me van a poner si quieren estar a favor o en contra del tema que se haya decidido. Dicho eso, ¿verdad? Yo voy a hacer todo lo posible para que usted esté en el lado que usted prefiera. Sin embargo, si son 25 de ustedes y 20 me dicen que quieren estar a favor del tema, pues obviamente tengo que dividirlos de una manera que sea justa. Quizás no les toque el lado que ustedes prefieren. Sin embargo, ¿verdad? Eso es un buen ejercicio en lo que viene siendo el counter argument, critical thinking. Van a tener 50 minutos ese día para prepararse en clase y luego los últimos 30 minutos de la clase serán el debate en sí. So that brings us to today's topic, which is critical thinking. What is it? How do we gain it? And how can it help us? So critical thinking is objective analysis and evaluation of an issue to form a judgment. So a lot of times we make decisions based on impulse, based on taste, based on preference, or based on previous experiences. So for example, if you don't like rock music and your friend invited you to go to a rock concert, you probably won't even look at some of the artist's songs, right? You're not going to open up Spotify or YouTube and go to listen to their repertoire because you know that you don't like rock music, you're probably just going to instinctively say no. Critical thinking then goes beyond, right? It is thinking that requires a lot more steps than we usually take in order to make as educated a decision as possible. So, an objective analysis and evaluation. First of all, things that you might consider if you're critically thinking about this. First of all, your friend is inviting you. If this is a close friend, if this is a friend who perhaps has done things with you that are not things that they're interested in. So let's say you really love to go shopping and this friend doesn't really enjoy it, but because they want to spend time with you, they often go shopping with you, right? You might consider, well, maybe I should go because this friend has done things for me that aren't their preference, so, I can make this kind of sacrifice and go to the concert. Another thing you might do when you're objectively evaluating this choice, you might go onto Spotify, you might go onto YouTube and see, well, my friend probably knows that I don't like rock music, so why are they inviting me? Maybe there's something about this band that they think I would like. So let's say that this is, you're a very political person. You're very interested in politics and in social justice, and as you look through this band's catalog, you realize that a lot of their songs are about social justice issues, right? So maybe that starts to connect with you, even if the music isn't your preference, lyrically you connect with these songs. So, you can go through a long evaluation to make your choice. You might have also practiced critical thinking when deciding what you wanted to study in college, right? Maybe you had to make a decision between something that you're passionate about but doesn't make a lot of money versus, maybe something that you don't like as much but that will ultimately be better financially, set you up financially more easily, right? So you probably sat down and evaluated, well, these are the topics that I'm interested in, and you looked at what some of the classes would be, and you decided, okay, I'd be interested more in these classes than in these, things like that, right, that helps you decide what to study, where to study it, and of course there was probably a lot of outside influence to that as well. Your parents probably had opinions, your friends probably had opinions, but you did some type of thorough analysis to decide, okay, I want to study this specific subject because I'm passionate about it and because of these financial reasons, and I want to do it at this school because, they're known for this, things like that. So while thinking only requires us to remember information, critical thinking is a lot more complex, right? So we think all the time, obviously that's how we operate as humans. However, thinking often is very much, whatever. I've been to Wendy's before and this is what I particularly like off of their menu. Or if somebody's asking you, let's say they've never been to Wendy's, right? And they're like, well, I don't really like hamburgers. I prefer, chicken sandwiches. Even if you don't order a chicken sandwich at Wendy's, you might remember having seen a few options on the menu. Critical thinking then would then make you go beyond, right? If this person is going to be limited in going to a place like Wendy's, then maybe we go to a place like Chick-fil-A that has obviously a lot more chicken sandwich based options, or maybe we look for something completely different that both of us like, so that neither group is limited or neither person is limited when going into, whatever it is that you're going to choose to eat. So there's a few steps to critical thinking. The first of these involves something along the lines of a question, an acknowledgement, or text assumptions. So if you are thinking about a particular topic, right, what questions do you have about it? Let's say we're considering the elections, right? Maybe you're for sure decided on one candidate for, being the governor, but maybe you don't know anything about who's running for, Senate, or who is running for the comisionado residente, or who is running to be the mayor of your town. So some questions you might ask yourself then when thinking critically about these elections is, am I going to vote íntegro, right? Am I going to vote fully for my party? Or am I open to actually seeing other options, right? Am I open to seeing what the governors are and, what their platforms are? Sorry, not the governors, the mayors, the senators, etc. And does that challenge my thinking? Maybe when I look at some of these proposals, I actually see that a candidate from a different party for comisionado residente or for mayor of my town aligns more with the things that I'm concerned about. In terms of acknowledgement, right, that entails realizing how much you know and how much you don't know about a topic, or acknowledging somebody's expertise, things like that. And then in terms of text assumptions, right, let's say you're reading a novel, right? And let's say it was just one that was assigned for an English class or a Spanish class. It wasn't really a book that you chose to read, and now you have to write an essay about it, a critical thinking essay or an analysis essay. So then you would look at this book and you could consider all sorts of things. You could consider the plot, you could consider writing techniques, you could consider information about the author, you could consider what themes you think show up. You could analyze a specific character, right? So how do you feel about these things? What messages do you think are being portrayed or conveyed in these texts? After that, you want to examine, interpret, evaluate, reason, and reflect to make informed decisions. So when we examine, right, we're looking at evidence. So let's go back to our example of the concert, right? So things that you're examining are your friendship with this person, your availability on the date of the concert, the actual music that this band is making, and you might consider things like the venue or what time the concert starts or ends, and how that might conflict with what you have scheduled for that same day earlier, or if you had plans for after, or if you have something going on early the next day. Then you want to interpret this information, right? So if I'm close to this friend and I've analyzed, this friend does often do things with me that aren't their preferred activities, and I don't have anything else going on the next day, and I didn't have plans for that day, and I'm actually resonating with some of, these lyrics, then you can interpret that as a favorable reason to go. You continue, right, evaluating the same way that you interpret. You apply reason, right? If I don't go, maybe my friend's feelings will be hurt, or maybe they'll feel frustrated because they go out of their way to do things with me that aren't their number one choice, and I can't do that for them. Or you might say, as much as these lyrics do connect with me, when I actually listen to the songs, I can't get into it, and it gives me a headache, or it stresses me out. Or, maybe you do have something else going on the next day. Maybe you have, or maybe not the next day, but a couple days after you have an exam for a class that's really difficult, right? And maybe you need the time that you would be at the concert to really hone in on the topics for that exam. And then you reflect to make an informed decision based on all of these observations that you have, right? And you can make a pros and cons list, for example. And so if you have that list and there's more pros and cons, the most informed decision would probably be then to go. Obviously, if on the opposite hand you have more cons than pros, then the best decision would be to not go, and then you can more easily explain to your friend beyond just saying, hey, that's not really my type of thing, right? You can acknowledge that, yeah, this friend, you appreciate they go out of their way to do things that maybe aren't their preferred choice, but you have this big exam and it's really important for you to have this time to study, but you'll, catch them next time, or the next show that they want to invite you to, you'll go. And lastly, you want to clarify, articulate, and justify your positions, right? That is what I just explained, right? After you've reflected on this, you're able to then clearly say, this is why I support or I don't support this. Let's say that you are set on voting for Juan Dalmau as governor, but then let's say you live in Guaynabo, and Guaynabo has for years and years been the mayor has been PNP. It's usually been one of the O'Neills. And you're like, honestly, I think things are working just fine. I think he's doing a decent job. And you might want to give your vote to Edward O'Neill for the governor. Sorry, for the mayor, because you think he's doing a fine job, and you don't really see a reason why he shouldn't be, why he should be taken out of his position. Things like that. So critical thinking allows us to rid ourselves of biases, distractions, and other elements that impact our decision making with little to no evidence. So essentially, when we think critically, we help ourselves get out of those fallacies, out of those biases that we've previously discussed. So, again, if we're thinking about this concert example, maybe my bias is that I've heard a handful of rock bands that I don't like, but maybe it's a specific subgenre, right? Maybe I don't like death metal, but I'm okay with punk, or I'm okay with pop punk, or I'm okay with like nu metal, things like that, where we've made an overall generalization or assumption of something based on our limited exposure to it. In terms of distractions, right, maybe we're thinking about other things that shouldn't really be affecting our decision, right? Maybe you're trying to decide if you should, what you should study in college, and you have your parents, maybe you want to study music, right? And your parents are saying, no, you should study something that's, going to be easier to make money in. And maybe you've decided that you want to study music in a place like Berkeley, which is known for, renowned for their music degrees. And you have your friends, though, being like, no, you should study in Sagrado because then we get to be together, right? So all of these things can create these distractions and can create pressure for us to make the choices that will make other people happy. So it's important to be able to say, okay, yeah, it would be cool to study with my friends, but if I've already been given an offer from a prestigious music university, it's going to be easier than to have a career in music with a degree from a prestigious music college than it will be from a college that's maybe not as known for that degree. Or, I understand that my parents are concerned, but, they're pushing me to become an accountant, and that would be dreadful and would kill my soul. So obviously, I would prefer to study music than to go into accounting, regardless of the financial disparities. So critical thinking expects us to observe a problem, to learn about it, analyze and evaluate through questions, and finally reach a conclusion that can be turned into a solution, right? So again, we've asked our questions of, okay, how, do I have anything else going on the day for the concert example? Do I have, am I actually going to listen to this band? What is my relationship with this friend? How often do they go out of their way to do things that they're not interested in just for me, etc., right? And so maybe our conclusion is, maybe we have too much going on and we don't think we're really going to have fun. So we'll say, hey, you're going to skip out on the concert, but here's what I'll do to make it up to you, right? I'm not really jiving with the sound, but I remember you mentioned you really wanted to go see this movie, so and that's coming out next week, so let's do that. Or there's this other artist that we both like, so then and they're coming to town, so let's plan to go to that concert together, right? So it's not simply then saying no, it's I'm saying no to this, but here's something else that we can look forward to doing in the future. A lot of our thought is biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, or prejudiced, right? Even if we think it's not. So, for example, I know that even if we're talking about, local universities, right? There's stereotypes about them, where La UP, often people are like, oh, well, those are just a bunch of, pelú, machetero, they're all far too political. And then a lot of people look at Sagrado and think of it as it's a much more privileged crowd. Obviously, those are generalizations, right? So people might then treat you differently based on that, right? People might assume that if you go to Sagrado, you're wealthy, that if you go to Sagrado, maybe you think you're better than other people, and that's not true necessarily, but it might come across in the way that others interpret who you are just based on where you went to school. It's the same thing if you say something like you went to Yale or Harvard, right? These are big schools, and maybe the person is not particularly that smart. Maybe they just got in there because they had connections or money or were a legacy student, right? But when you see that, you're impressed, and you tend to treat people who maybe went to Harvard or Yale with a lot more respect than you would somebody who has a degree from, a random university. Our thoughts can also be distorted based on our relationship with a person, right? We talked about the horns and the halo effect. If you really don't like somebody, and they're going to be at an event that you want to go to, Maybe you'll choose not to go, even though it's what you really wanted to do, just to avoid seeing this person. Maybe we're overplaying how they would behave or how uncomfortable we would be in that situation. In terms of being partial, right? Even if you've thoroughly researched something, there's always going to be something that you don't know. Or a lot of times, right, we'll fall into those rabbit holes where a lot of the, those confirmation biases, things like that, where we fall into echo chambers of only reading the things that support our views, and maybe there's a big important point on the other side that we haven't considered. And that also goes with being uninformed, right? Maybe we go online and we're seeing everybody support a specific cause and being in favor of a specific person or a specific side of a conflict, but we don't actually take the time to inform ourselves, and we instantly demonize then the opposition without really knowing what's going on. Or obviously, in terms of prejudice, whether it's, a positive bias or a negative one, obviously our prejudice can deeply affect a lot of the things that we say and do. So critical thinking helps us think of the important questions and problems, gather relevant information, leads to unbiased conclusions, and improves our open-mindedness and communication skills. Right? When we're able to actually think about why we believe the things that we do or when we make the choices that we do, it helps us to be more open-minded. Maybe we're thinking, yeah, I don't like rock music, but this friend often does things for me, and maybe I hadn't realized that, right? Maybe I hadn't really internalized how much they do for me, outside of their preferences or their comfort zone, and now I'm more grateful about it, and that makes me more open to doing things that they like to do that perhaps aren't in my wheelhouse. Or maybe I went to the concert being a little bit unsure and I actually ended up loving it, and now I like this band and I'm looking at artists like this band because I've expanded my tastes. And it also helps in communication, right? If you're able to actually explain your choices beyond just cause, or I just don't want to, or it's what I want to do, it's really helpful. So obviously, right, if you, for example, if you're really passionate about studying music and your parents are like, you're going to starve to death, you shouldn't do that. If you're able to actually sit down with them and show them, hey, okay, outside of, being a musician, there's things that I can do with this degree. For example, I could go be a music teacher, or I could go on to work in marketing, right? Writing jingles and songs for advertisements. I could go into making music for films. I could go into music therapy, right? There's a lot more avenues than perhaps what your parents are thinking. And if you can comfort them by letting them know, hey, this isn't the dead end that you think it is, that's going to be a lot more helpful than just saying, this is my passion, this is my dream, and, you just have to suck it up and let me do what I want to do. So there's a few ways to think critically. We're going to go through a couple models today. So the first of these, there's a 6-step model for effective critical thinking. The first of these, right, we've talked a little bit before about knowledge. What is the topic? And what is the issue with it? And we talked about that in the first oral discussion, right? What makes it something debatable? What makes it important? What makes it pressing? Why does it need to be solved? So having open questions can stimulate thinking and discussion. So closed questions are questions that you can answer with yes and no. Open questions require a lot more thinking, right? They're a lot more thorough. So let's say, we're talking about the elections again, right? Okay, this is the candidate I'm voting for. Why? What in his platform or her platform makes me want to vote for them? What have they said in debates? What do they have online, right? What information do I know about this person that aligns with my values, with my beliefs, with my vision for the future, etc. In terms of comprehension, right? Observe the problem at hand and collect data that can help you better understand it and draw potential solutions. So that's where a big chunk of evidence comes in. What are the facts? If you're looking at, for example, the situation in Palestine, right? What are the facts? How is this affecting Palestinians, but also how is it affecting Israelis, and how is it affecting Jewish people outside of Israel and Palestine? How is it affecting Palestinian people outside of Palestine? How is it affecting policy How is it affecting international relations? How is it affecting even the elections, right? Things like that. And then who is affected, right? Why are they affected? And what's the result of this impact? So obviously, Palestinians are affected in a different way than Jewish people. So Jewish people, perhaps outside of Israel, um, are facing a lot of um, xenophobia, right? Because people generalize that if you are Jewish, you must be in favor of Israel, which is not the case. And if you're a Palestinian, right, you're being forced out of your home. A lot of your opportunities for healthcare, for education, etc., are gone now. You have no choice but to leave your home. And then what is the time sensitivity, right? Is this something that needs to be dealt with immediately, or is this something that could potentially, to a certain extent, right, wait a little bit longer? So beyond that, right, we have application. Deeply entwined with comprehension, application requires us to think about what is needed to solve the problem in terms of resources. So let's say, for example, you are a manager at a store, right? And there are scheduling concerns. So you have employees who have needs, right? So perhaps they are students. So there are certain days or certain times where they cannot be scheduled. Or you have you have employees who are parents and they have specific needs in terms of being able to pick up their children or attend kind of their extracurricular activities or their medical appointments. You maybe have somebody on your team who has a disability, who also has special accommodations that they need, or maybe somebody who relies on transportation that is not theirs. They rely on rides from people, and it's easier to get rides earlier than it is later. Those are needs as opposed to people who have preferences, right? You might have people who just simply say, it's not that I have anything going on over the weekend, I just would rather not work. Or it's not that I can't work in the mornings, it's just that I'd rather not, right? So when you're thinking then both in terms of hiring and then in terms of developing these schedules, you have to put into account what those needs and preferences are. You also have to consider the employee's performance, right? If you have an employee who's constantly no call, no showing, if you have somebody who's constantly getting their shifts covered, if you have somebody who is constantly late, or has gotten in trouble before, that's a person you probably will have less flexibility with than somebody who is consistently on time, who often picks up shifts, who often goes above and beyond, etc. In terms of analysis, right, now that you have a clear handle on what the issue is, lay out its strongest and weakest points and name the challenges that could come when problem solving. Okay, so we're thinking about this specific example about scheduling. What are the strongest points for these employees, right? That's what we just talked about. Who shows up all the time, who doesn't, who goes above and beyond, who doesn't, who's been here longer, who hasn't. And then what are the weakest points, right? So again, who's always late, who no call, no shows, who is irresponsible, who isn't a team player, who is perhaps not great with customers. And then what are the challenges that could come with the decisions that we make, right? So obviously, if we have a preference for our employees who are consistent, then we specifically had somebody say, I'm not a morning person, I don't do mornings, and we schedule them for a bunch of morning shifts. Realistically, the challenge is going to be that person is not going to show up, especially if they've already made it a clear pattern that they are not consistent. On the other hand, right, if we say, well, this is the schedule that the person has been the most responsible with, right, if I then choose to accommodate the less strong employee, then how is that going to make my responsible employee feel, right? They might think, well, I'm going to find another job because I'm obviously not valued here, because instead of giving me this accommodation for my classes or for my health or for my children, I'm stuck with these complicated schedules, and then they're making it easier for the person who maybe doesn't work as hard. So list the main causes of the issue, right? What are often the reasons why people can't work specific shifts? And prioritize what needs to be addressed in the solution. Beyond that, we have synthesis. So you want to make a decision regarding how to move forward and what steps should be taken. Right? So what is the next step? Maybe I bring in my people, right? And I talk to them. Hey, I get that you want to be there for your kids' soccer game, but realistically, with the employees that we have right now, nobody's going to be able to cover that Saturday shift, and that is our busiest day, so we can't decide to just close on that day. Would you be open to at least doing every other, right? Or, we can try and schedule you so you can be there for the first half or the second half of the game, but you can't, simply not work that day. Or, hey, I get that you're not a morning person, but when you were hired to do this job, you knew what the schedules were, and so I need you to be more consistent, and we can work on slowly getting you to an earlier schedule, but you can't simply say that you're not going to work mornings. Note that there may be more than one potential solution. Therefore, evaluate and prioritize these to choose the best one, right? So let's say that our scheduling issue is affecting Mondays. If Monday is a very slow day and you are the owner of the company, you can simply decide to just close on Mondays, because then you save on payroll, you're not stressed out about scheduling, you save on utilities, but it helps you out, and you're not really losing money, or at least not that much. However, that isn't necessarily the case if it's, let's say, a Friday or a Saturday, which are much busier days. Or maybe it's about hiring more seasonal employees. Maybe it's about hiring better employees, more reliable employees, and then getting rid of the ones that are slacking off, because then all of the work isn't falling onto one person. Maybe it's about if there's no way around it and we have to make this person work more shifts or work particular shifts that take away from their time to do other things, maybe we compensate them in a different way, right? Maybe we promote them, maybe we give them a raise, right? Something that says, hey, we know we're kind of giving you the short end of the stick here, but we want to then be able to let you know that we do appreciate the work that you do. And then in terms of action, once you've defined the solution that benefits most, take actionable steps to put your solution in motion. And we've talked about this notion of the greater good before, right? We make choices that impact the most amount of people in the best possible way. So, sometimes the easiest way to do that, maybe in this case, right, we're going to take two actions at the same time. For now, while we either hire more reliable people or get the people that we currently have slowly up to, working these shifts that they don't want to do for, not really that, very important reasons, we'll pay you extra, right? We'll pay you time and a half, or we'll give you a raise, or we'll give you a promotion, so that, we're giving you a benefit while we're also trying to find a more long-term solution that doesn't entail exploiting one worker for the sake of everyone else. Another method is known as the Paul Elder Framework. So here you consider a few things. First of these goals, master thinking through 3 stages. And these 3 stages are reasoning, intellectual standards, and intellectual traits. So reasoning includes things like implications and consequences. Okay, let's say I do say to my best employee, hey, I get that you want to be there at your kids' games, but the people who are working here right now, they're not the most reliable, and so we need you to take these shifts, and we'll pay you extra, or we'll give you a promotion, but we need you to keep working these. This person, even if they appreciate that you're going to pay them more, might still decide, well, I need to find a different job, right? Or I don't think it's fair that I'm still expected, even if you're paying me more money, I don't think it's fair that I'm still expected to pick up the slack for everybody else. Purpose, right? What is the purpose of this choice that we're making, right? In this case, right, we want the business to succeed, and for that we need to be able to stay open on our busiest day, which is Saturday, and we're having a hard time staffing that. Attempt, right? Hey, let's do this on a trial basis, right? Maybe before we go immediately into making you work all of these shifts with higher pay, what we'll do is we'll give you every other shift so that you can go to every other game, and we'll be working on these shifts to make sure that these employees are better prepared. Assumption, right? Maybe you're assuming if I give them more money, this person will stay. That's not necessarily true. Maybe you're assuming, hey, these employees just need more training to be better. Maybe they won't get better. Point of view, right? Am I looking at this from the perspective of the employee, right? Who's maybe overworked, who's missing out on activities with their family, etc. Or am I looking at this from the perspective of the owner, right? If this person isn't here, I lose money, or I have to work more because then I have to cover the shifts that these employees that aren't as responsible aren't going to make it to. Data, evidence, information, right? Let's say we are then evaluating the performance of these employees. We're looking at how often they're late. We're looking at how often they've been scheduled to be there on a specific date and then they just don't show up, or they switch the shift with somebody else. Versus obviously the employee who's responsible, how often do they not show up, right? Is it reasonable or unreasonable, the request that's being made? Concepts and ideas, right? What can we do to solve this problem in a way that benefits everybody? Inferences and interpretations, right? If I'm looking at this information and I'm looking at different points of views, and I'm looking at the data, how can I interpret and infer from this information what is most likely to happen? So, for example, if I'm seeing an employee who every single time they've been scheduled for a Saturday morning, they have never shown up, I can easily infer that's not a person who you can, train up to being more open to working these shifts. However, if we have somebody who has shown up to every other one of those shifts, or who maybe at the start were, kind of slacking off, but now they've become more reliable, that's very different. Intellectual standards, things like clarity. How clear is this information, right? Is it something that's easy to understand, or is the data vague, right? So, for example, let's say that I am assessing essays and I have a concern about the use of AI. Now, if it's something where, let's say, 5 different platforms are telling me there's between 80 and 100% chance of it being AI, that's a lot more clear than if I go through these 5 platforms and one of them says 80, one of them says 22, one of them says 7, one of them says none, no AI, right? That's a lot harder because the data is not as clear. And then I have to kind of go through the work and perhaps compare it to previous work that the student has done, and then make a decision based on that, on whether I feel that the work was done mostly by the student, or if it's entirely AI. Accuracy. So, how accurate are both these models and my assessments of students' work? So, for example, if I have a student who, let's say you've had 2 online discussions, and then this is your first paper, and I don't have another paper to compare it to, but I have the oral discussions, and if the language used in the oral discussions is very informal, if there's a lot of sentence fragments, if there's a lot of incorrect use of vocabulary or punctuation, and then I'm looking at this essay and it looks perfectly polished, as if it had been written by somebody who English is their first language, maybe I can say, there's something strange here, because it's odd that, in a period of perhaps a month or a month and a half, a student has somehow magically improved their ability to write, and I'm also getting these results, as opposed to, obviously, if I don't have anything else to compare it to, and I'm getting these mixed results from the AI checkers, right, then it's harder to make that decision. And then I have to base it on, well, what is the average ability of a student writer? How have I heard this person express themselves in class? Things like that. Relevance, right? When I'm looking at this information, maybe this the relevance of AI was that, like, the use of AI was that this person used it for like a grammar check, and instead of manually changing things, they just copy pasted it. Maybe they used a translator, or Grammarly. There are things that still come up as AI, even though the work was done by the student, right? Depth and breadth, right? How excessive is this use? Usually for me, if it comes up as 30% or less, that's fine. Anything beyond that, I usually will email you to be like, hey, this is coming up and it's kind of weird. Use of logic, right? So again, if I've seen that this student doesn't write at the level that their essay is coming across as, I can deduce that they didn't do the work. Significance, right? What is the significance of me either deciding to give or to not give the student another opportunity, right? If it's the first time that I'm catching them potentially using AI, I'm going to be a lot more flexible to them redoing the assignment than I would be if it's the second time, or if it's, your final essay. I'm probably going to be like, this would be the third time we're having this conversation. You've never written an assignment for this class, as far as I can tell, and so you get a 0. And then fairness, right? So let's say that I have a student who perhaps I had them before in a different class, and I get along well with them, and then I know their personal life is perhaps challenging, so I give them all these additional chances, but then I have another student who I don't know, and I don't give them the same chances, right? That's not fair, and that's not ethical, right? I would have to make sure that I'm not being overly flexible with one student or overly strict with a different one, particularly because of perhaps a previous relationship. And then intellectual traits, things like humility, right? Being able to say, I don't know enough about this, or I was wrong about this. Courage, being able to try new things, being open to actually standing up for yourself and your ideas. Empathy, being able to be understanding of the other person and their point of view. Integrity, right? Even if everybody else agrees, let's say we're at this board meeting deciding what we're going to do with these employees and this schedule, and, essentially it ends up coming across in a way where the committee decides this person is not going to get paid more and they have to show up to these shifts because nobody else is going to do them. If I'm a person with integrity and I know that that employee deserves a lot more flexibility than my other employees, I would have to stand up and say, hey, that's not fair, because this employee has worked really hard. They've been at this company for years. They rarely ever miss. They're always taking care of everybody else, and now you want to cut them out, or essentially punish them for something that is not their fault. Perseverance, right? Our ability to continue trying in the face of failure. Confidence in reason, right? Being able to say, I've looked at the facts and I am as objectively sure of my decision as possible, and being fair-minded, right? Yeah, okay, maybe this employee slacked off a lot in the beginning, but they've been improving. I'm not going to be as harsh with that employee as I would be with an employee who has been here for maybe 6 months to a year, and they've always been a slacker, and somehow they've just gotten away with it, but it's not really fair. Another way to think about critical thinking, or to practice critical thinking, are the 8 elements of reasoning. The first of this, purpose. What is the topic's goal or objective? So why are we talking about this, and what do we want to gain from this? So if we're talking about college, right, maybe I'm trying to figure out what's my best option in terms of a major and what's the best place to go to. If we're talking about the elections, maybe I'm trying to figure out what are these candidates' platforms and how do they align or not with my values. Attempt, then, you want to consider previous attempts to address or solve a problem and why they did or didn't work. So let's say, again, that we're in our fictitious managerial role at this store, and I worked at a different store before this one as a manager, and we had a similar situation, and what worked best was to, for example, be more flexible with the reliable employee, and pay them more, because then we were only giving them the shifts that were impossible to schedule otherwise, but then they had a more set schedule, so it's easier. For example, let's say instead of their kids, it's a medical situation, right? Now every week they know what hours that they're going to work, so it's easier to schedule appointments and take care of yourself than it is when you have a rotating schedule that changes every single week, right? Or it worked out better to pay them more money because even though they are perhaps missing out on certain things, right, they're also a lot more stable financially, or maybe with a promotion they have more paid time off, which allows them a little bit more flexibility, right? Or maybe, getting rid of the employees who are always unreliable made the ones that are kind of shaky be more productive, right? So what things have worked out before? Assumptions. What do we assume about the topic in order to base our research? So if we think something is bad, that is usually going to come across in the way that we research it, right? If I'm dead set on believing that people who believe in conspiracy theories are inherently malicious, I might go out of my way to, when I'm Googling about the topic, right? Why are conspiracy theories dangerous? Why are conspiracy theorists evil, right? Why do conspiracy theorists misinform people? As opposed to doing something a little bit more neutral, right? Where do conspiracy theories come from? Why do people believe them? And then what can you deduce, and how does research validate your assumptions, right? So maybe something isn't gonna, maybe in my research, right, it's not gonna necessarily tell me that conspiracy theories directly seek to misinform people, but maybe I find a study that shows that people who believe in conspiracies usually target people with less education because it's easier to convince them, right? So that does have a degree of maliciousness, or at least of bias, and that can validate then my opinion that this is done in the search of misinformation, as opposed to a genuine belief. And then point of view, right? Personal perspective about the topic, not necessarily yours, right? If I put myself in the shoes of somebody who believes in conspiracy theories, what is their perspective when they look at this information? What makes it seem accurate to them? And then what angle do you want to look at the topic from? And how is that going to influence the results that you get? Then we have data, information, and evidence. What data have you collected about the topic? Is it something along the lines of you reached out to people who are known for being conspiracy theorists and sat down and had an interview with them? Or is it simply that you looked online at, their social media, their posts, their blogs, things like that? What information do you know or gain through research? Right? What were you able to find? And what supporting evidence do you have or do you need? Right? So if your claim is that conspiracy theorists overall have a malicious intent to misinform and specifically target people with lower levels of education, do you have evidence that shows that, or is it an assumption? In terms of the concepts and ideas, right, principles, models, or theories that could work to solve the problem. How do we then curb the spread of misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories, right? How do we then address these gaps in education? How do we help people become more literate? How do we encourage people to think more critically so that they're not as easily fooled? Inferences and interpretations based on the previous elements. What can you conclude and what are potential solutions? All right, we've talked about that a bit. And then implications and consequences. What is the result or impact of implementing all elements into a single conclusion? Right? So if my conclusion is that, right, conspiracy theories seek maliciously to misinform people who are less educated, am I then making a generalization that could lead into a logical bias or a logical fallacy? And then what does this mean for the problem? Right? Because if my solution is, well, people need to be more media literate and more educated, that creates a huge problem because we don't necessarily have the financial resources to do that. Beyond that, we have a third model, the 9 intellectual standards. The first of this, which we talked about, was clarity, right? Elaborate on the topic, show what you mean, and provide examples. So, recently there was somebody who was on Jugando Pelotadura, I think, or one of these local political shows, and they were talking about the social media campaigns of the politicians running for government, and it came up, they were talking about how a lot of the PNP platform has been about this whole notion of communism. And this person, who's supposed to be an expert, was asked to define communism, and they were unable to do so, right? So when we go into talking about something, we need to know what we're talking about, right? We need to be able to explain, communism is an ideology that came from the USSR that was created by Karl Marx that believes in eradicating private property and sharing everything, and kind of it's in favor of what's known as the proletariat or the working class, and it is very much against the elite, things like that, right? So you need to be able to show, hey, I know what I'm talking about. In terms of accuracy, right? Be able to verify your information. If you read something, maybe you saw it on a TikTok, and maybe the TikTok is accurate, but take a moment to then find a source online that's more reliable than the TikTok. Ensure its truth, and run tests or other verification processes. So if you did just one subset experiment, right? You asked 10 people in a specific community how they became believers of a conspiracy theory, and they kind of had similar answers. Test that with different communities to see if the result is always the same. In terms of position, be as specific as possible, provide details, and be accurate by avoiding omissions and preparing thoroughly. So knowing what the counter arguments and the questions are going to be, and making sure that you're not leaving out information just for the sake of your point, right? So if I say, hey, I saw this article, and let's say that I am talking about this specific article that talks about how people with lower education are more susceptible to conspiracy theories, but then I just used that as a quote, but then later on in the paper it says, actually, we ran an experiment and there were people of all educational backgrounds who were susceptible to misinformation, right? If I leave that out, that's, on me, right? That's irresponsible. And then relevance, the relationship to the problem, influence on the question at hand, and the role in problem solving. How is the information that I'm collecting relevant to the solution that I am proposing, which in this hypothetical case is making people more media literate. Depth and breadth, right? What are the challenges, complexities, and other perspectives? Maybe I'm looking at this from the perspective of somebody who is very logical and can easily tell and somebody who's very educated versus somebody who's not. Or maybe there have been things that started out as conspiracy theories and then ended up being evidence. What do we do with that information? Logic, make sure all parts make sense together. Draw clear links between different paragraphs, and does evidence effectively support points? And we've talked about that before. In terms of significance, right, the time sensitivity or importance of the issue, right? More and more we're seeing fake news be spread, and it affects a lot of things, including how people vote, and how they treat other people and the biases that they might develop. What are the key issues, right? Some conspiracy theories are harmless to a certain extent. Others are a lot more damaging. And then the importance of facts being considered. In terms of fairness, right? Justify the thought process. Why did I reach this conclusion, and how did I do that? Consider other points of view, right? Where are the people who do support these conspiracy theories coming from? Justify the purpose. It is important to teach media literacy because, these conspiracy theories are now having an effect on elections and racism and all sorts of things, and ensuring facts are not skewed, right? So if I looked at a study, I need to critically look at, did they actually evaluate people from different educational backgrounds, or did they only study or interview people from lower educational backgrounds, but then didn't actually bother to look at how people in different educational backgrounds were doing. In terms of the 7 intellectual traits, right, we went over these a little bit ago, right? Intellectual perseverance, right? Adequate insight regarding barriers, difficulties, frustrations, and obstacles. For example, as an educator, when I'm seeing a student who is underperforming, do I actually have enough information on the student to consider, hey, they're really just, I've tried everything. I've reached out to the student. I've offered them accommodations. I've offered them tutoring. I've offered them makeup assignments, etc. I've tried to talk to the student. I've given them opportunities, and they just refuse to kind of cooperate with me. Or is a student who I know has a special accommodation, or who maybe is responsive when I offer them a makeup assignment, or lets me know later on that there is something personal going on, or something in terms of a learning disability, etc. So, those students are treated differently based on, how can I assess their actual commitment to the course. Is it somebody who maybe shows up to every single class and participates, but then there's something going on when it comes to submitting assignments that I can get to the bottom of, or is it somebody who just doesn't show up and doesn't do anything and doesn't respond, right? Those things are different when I'm assessing that. Intellectual courage, being fair regardless of point of view or negative attitudes towards a topic, and eliminate presumptions and perceptions. So, for example, when I first started doing academic writing tutoring, that was one of my biggest challenges. I had a student submit an essay where essentially their claim was that immigrants purposefully would take their children with them towards the border in hopes that they would get separated so that an American family could raise their child. And I had a lot of opinions about that, and I reached out to some of my colleagues and some of my previous professors, essentially asking, hey, what do you do when you come across something that you disagree with in a paper, but obviously that's not what you're grading, right? And their advice was to focus on what I'm supposed to be assessing, right? So that's essentially where intellectual courage plays a role, right? I have to be able to say, even if I disagree with this point of view, is there evidence? In her case, there wasn't, so my comment was something along the lines of either mark this as an opinion or make sure that you find an article that supports your perspective. But for example, I've had students write papers that are about topics that I don't agree with them. But when I grade them, right, I put aside those feelings and I look at that, right? Is it well developed? Is it, does it have evidence? Is the grammar correct? Is the format correct? And that's how I, approach that, because I can't let a student who's probably a good student and who has done the work properly, it is incorrect of me and unethical of me to fail them, obviously, just because I disagree with the topic that they've proposed. Confidence in reason. Build one's confidence in reason and rational thinking as well as others. So taking the time to practice critical thinking, but also to encourage it in other people. When people then say to you, well, this is what I believe, ask them why, right? Make them think a little bit more deeply about where these ideas and thoughts and beliefs are coming from. And sometimes they might realize, well, I'm only saying these things because it's what my parents taught me and I never looked at it beyond that. Or they might generally have support that you didn't know about. Fair-mindedness, right? I think that's supposed to say analysis. Ability to set aside one's feelings, interests, and needs and consider all viewpoints, right? It doesn't matter how I feel about this topic. Or let's say that I am the company owner for our fictitious scheduling problem, right? Then I should be able to say, okay, well, if we can't find people to cover the shift, then we are going to have to temporarily close on this day, even if we make less money, because it's unfair on we're going to lose a great employee because we have a bunch of people who are unreliable and we're putting too much pressure on them. And then, right, considering all points of views and needs. So, other ways to look at critical thinking, right? Step 1 being understanding the link between ideas. How does your evidence connect to your conclusion, right? How do these things make cohesive sense together? Or perhaps are we looking at two different issues that overlap in one way but have different solutions. And we've talked about this before when I've mentioned, gun control. Right? Yeah, there is a problem in that there are some very rural areas in the States where police officers take very long to show up. But that's not really a gun problem, that's a resource problem with the police department. Right? So being able to have a personal gun to protect yourself because the police is going to take forever to show up is very different than, the most of the situations where we are seeing a lot of young people particularly having very easy access to guns, and then committing atrocities. Step 2, identify, construct, and evaluate arguments. What are my arguments? What is my evidence for those? And then is it a strong argument or is it weak? And so if we're talking about gun reform, I personally don't really love guns. They kind of scare me, right? But I can see uses for them even if I wouldn't do them. That makes sense, right? Hunting being one of them. Or self-defense to a certain extent if you have a very specific situation, and it's a very, just a regular handgun. That's very different than like a machine gun. Right? So if I were to say as my argument, guns are scary and they're only used to kill people, that is not a strong argument, right? Because there are other uses for guns, beyond, killing people. People use it for sport aside from hunting. There's shooting ranges and things that people use. So I have to be able to have sound arguments as opposed to arguments based on the way that I feel about the topic. Finding inconsistencies and errors, right? Maybe I found one paper that shows a massive link between mental health and gun use, but I have a lot more that show that it's not really as big a mental health issue as it is a regulations issue. I can't simply use that one example as my basis for it if that is my argument, right? I have to say that, yes, there's evidence that demonstrates that there is a link, but there's even more evidence actually that's looking at it from a completely different perspective that seems to be more tethered to what's actually going on. And then having that solution, right? So, what is my proposed solution? Is it a complete ban on guns? Is it a ban on specific types of guns, right? So people can still have, hunting rifles, but they can't have semi-automatic weapons. Is it to test people yearly to assess whether they still should retain or not their right to have this weapon? Is it having stricter regulations so that not just anyone can walk into a Walmart and get a gun? Right? Should it be a more complex process, etc.? Step 5, identifying relevance, right? What are the key factors that make it something important, right? We're looking at things like school shootings. We're looking at things like police brutality. We're looking at things like mass shootings that are consistent problems that we continue to see yearly. Identify the importance of these ideas, right? Why does it matter? How is it affecting our communities? How is it affecting our safety? How is it affecting our perception of certain people? Reflecting on your own beliefs and values, obviously that is important to say, hey, maybe I grew up in a very anti-gun household or a very pro-gun household, and that affects the way that I look at these things, right? People who grew up with guns, particularly in the context of hunting, might simply see them as tools to feed your family, as opposed to somebody who only understands guns in the context of violence, who instinctively attaches their perception of guns as dangerous and inherently evil. And then developing that argument, right? Based on these evaluations, maybe my original argument was that guns should be entirely banned, but after I've reflected on how my personal beliefs affect it, and after I've looked at a lot of evidence, right, maybe I can shift that to say, well, they shouldn't be banned, but these specific types of regulations are needed, and this is what has worked perhaps in other countries to make ownership safer as opposed to impossible or banned. Benefits of critical thinking. It is a transferable skill in any job, right? You might think. I always try to make this as applicable to your lives as possible. It doesn't matter what work you do. you're going to have to use critical thinking at some point to make a decision. If you're a musician, for example, and you're being offered a gig but it's unpaid, right, you can weigh those benefits if you think critically, right? Okay, an unpaid gig at this, like, a random parking lot in this Chinchorro in Ponce. If you live far away from Ponce, probably not worth it. However, an unpaid gig at, El Coca-Cola or El Festival Caridad, or, something that has a huge crowd that might give you a lot more exposure might be more worth it than the other option. If you are doing business, right, you need to think critically about what the decisions that you're making in terms of long-term as well as short-term goals and solutions, right? Sometimes we want to go for the short-term solution because it solves the problem instantly, right? We make this one specific employee have to take up all these shifts, but then that might lead to that employee quitting, as opposed to, hey, we temporarily close on Saturdays, we make a little less money, but then we find reliable people so that our scheduling issues are not that complicated. Even obviously in teaching, right? I already mentioned, if I'm looking at a paper and I have doubts about whether the student did it or not, or if I'm looking at a student who maybe was like a great student and then suddenly they disappeared on me, critical thinking helps me be a lot more reasonable when I make these decisions and when I reach out to students, so that I'm not basing anything off of assumptions that might be erroneous. It makes you adapt to changes quickly and effectively, right? If you're able to think critically, okay, why did this happen? This sucks, but hey, here's a benefit that's going to come with it, right? And it can be something as simple as even friendships ending, right? It's very difficult to process that, but if you have perhaps what was an unhealthy friendship that ended, it might either push you to be a better person if you were kind of at fault, or it will help you see how your mental health can be better away from certain toxic environments, and it makes it easier then to move on. Improve language and presentation skills, right? Obviously, the more we think critically, the more we have to explain ourselves to others, and that helps us be able to speak more clearly, more concisely, more precisely. And it also helps us present ideas in a much more persuasive way. It promotes creativity and problem solving, right? When we're having to think critically and we're having to consider different points of views and different solutions and their impact, it makes us have to think outside the box. It makes us think beyond what is the instant solution. So, for example, there is a tendency here in Puerto Rico to go for the easiest solution, right? That's why instead of redoing all the roads with better, higher quality materials, it's essentially a bunch of parches that are messed up in a matter of weeks or months, right? So being able to then think critically, okay, this is a short-term solution, but like long-term, what are we going to do? And how does that help us? Self-reflection, critical thinking helps us then identify those biases, those logical fallacies, those issues with reasoning, those prejudices that we might have that affect the way that we are actually interpreting a situation. And it is the foundation of science and democracy. Beyond that, it helps us recognize, create, and analyze arguments more easily, right? When we are able to think critically, we can see, okay, this is what this person is saying, and here's the evidence that they have for it. How would I respond to that, right? Or is this actually a strong argument, or are there fallacies and biases in it? It helps us identify different angles for the same topic, right? It makes us think outside of our own perception, outside of our own point of view, and say, hey, why do people believe this? What makes this so compelling for others? It assesses the validity of a point of view, right? It helps us then understand, okay, maybe even if I still don't agree with this, I can understand where they're coming from. It identifies weaknesses and negative points, right? Where does my point of view or where does my argument fail? And what then can I do to solve that? It helps us assess who said it, right? Who is this person? What is their authority? Are we talking about it? What they said? What was the context of it? Was it in response to something? Where? Right? Was this at a political convention, or was this in passing, or was this in a personal text chat? When? Why and how? Right? How was that information conveyed? Why did they say it? In what way did it come across, etc. It can also help us identify communication or persuasion goals, right? If my goal is to convince people to, for example, support this specific gun reform, right, then that's my persuasive goal. I know that I need to make sure that people see that I'm not saying that guns should be banned, but that there do need to be certain restrictions or policies that help make them safer. And then it helps us develop foresight, right? It makes us develop our ability for long-term thinking. So instead of being like, okay, if I do this tonight, let's say, for example, you have a massive essay due on Saturday, and you haven't started it, and it's Friday, and you decide you're going to go out, and you stay out until 3 in the morning, there's a chance that essay is not going to get done, right? But then when we have foresight, we can say, yeah, okay, this would be fun to do, but I have an assignment to do, and perhaps I didn't do that well in the previous assignment, so I should, stay home, finish this assignment, and then I can go out next week, or else it's going to impact me negatively. Some ways we can improve our critical thinking skills: clarify thinking, purpose, and context, right? What is our background and what is our aim in the way that we think about things, and then how does that affect the way that we then view a topic? If I come from so for example, here, a lot of times when we think about guns, we think about police officers or drug dealers, right? There's not really necessarily a lot of casual exposure to guns, as opposed to, for example, Ohio is an open carry state, so you might just be randomly walking around and somebody's just walking around with a rifle strapped to their back, and it's very jarring, but it's a very different context. Question sources of information, right? Who is writing this? Is there some type of ulterior motive here, right? The way that they're presenting this information, you maybe fact check it, things like that. Identifying arguments, analyzing sources and arguments, right? What are these arguments strong, or are they filled with a lot of questions? Are these sources clearly biased? Evaluating others' arguments, and then obviously consistently creating your own. So that will be the end of today's class. Les recuerdo, por favor, la próxima clase tienen su collaborative learning assignment, prep day 1. Son muy importantes que lleguen a tiempo. Si se va a ausentar, me lo notifican a mí y a su grupo. Y para el 16 tienen que llegar preparados. Si no, les toca completar el trabajo individualmente. Y el trabajo se entrega como video solo por una persona del grupo el 18. El 21 tienen su tercera discusión oral. El 14 les voy a estar enviando por email y por Canva sus grupos. Van a tener 50 minutos para prepararse en clase y presentan al final. Y el 30 tienen un debate. El 16 les voy a llevar 3 temas para que escojan uno. Luego de que se escoja el tema, los voy a dividir en a favor o en contra. Ustedes van a ya haberme dicho su preferencia. Yo voy a hacer todo lo posible, como les dije, para que su preferencia sea la que le toque, pero si la mayoría está de un lado, pues tengo que dividirlos de una manera que se ajusta. Van a tener 50 minutos para preparar su punto de vista en la clase, y luego al fin, los últimos 30 minutos van a tener el debate. Cualquier dudita o pregunta que tengan mientras tanto me dejan saber, y nos vemos el miércoles en el salón.